the challenge presented by the right wing and Walker in the state of Wisconsin is an obvious one. But I go back when I was I was just a kid. Joe McCarthy came from this state. Well, you've got to challenge that, but it is not beyond being challenged, as we've seen in Wisconsin itself, where Walker seems to be backpedaling as fast as he can for fear that actually a recall movement will get him. So the power of the people, and it's not just the, quote, most oppressed. It is middle-class people who are losing their jobs. It is teachers. It is firemen. It is not only public workers. And it is people who sense, and young people who sense, there is something profoundly wrong with this. Walker did not campaign on what he did. He came into office and then attempted a radical right revolution without a mandate, without being campaigning for this and saying he's got that mandate. So I think there is a real possibility, if you again look at this particular state, historically it has generated the Follett on the one hand and the Gaylord Nelsons on the other, the founder of Earth Day, and Nelson came after McCarthy. So those are really interesting, again, historical ways to see this time. The question is whether or not we take advantage of this sharp pain from the Walkerites and begin to develop the next politics out of it. And a politics that goes well beyond electing progressives, that begins to say, no, the issues are deeper. They involve large corporate structures. They involve the structure of the economy. They involve who owns things. The top 400 people in the United States own more wealth than the bottom 150 million. Let me say it again, the top 400 people own more wealth than the bottom 150 million, half the society. That is medieval. And I don't mean that rhetorically. That's the way medieval society was organized, and you cannot have a democracy if that goes on. So ultimately, it's more about, not only about politics and elections, it's about changing the ownership and distribution of wealth. And that's what these building from the bottom, co-ops, worker-owned companies, the development of larger structures based on that, an evolutionary vision and an intelligent vision of how you get beyond the terrible problems that happened under the kind of socialist systems that we know about and build a modern system that actually is American in content, community building, but also takes care of business at the higher levels and is serious about large-scale industry and how we own it, and the auto companies and the big oil companies. 60% of the world, oil companies are owned by the government. It's conventional. Here it's anathema. We've got to build to the place where we can take on the big issues. But it's a process where people have to really rethink what they're doing, not only because they need to learn and understand it, but there's plenty of dangers in the excessively centralized systems that we know about. The traditional socialist system did not end up producing what they had hoped to produce. So we're going to have to come up with a different vision. I call it a pluralist commonwealth that has many forms, cooperatives, worker-owned companies, neighborhood corporations, but also some public forms. It's a plural ways to democratize the ownership of capital rather than allow 400 people to own half of the capital in the country, which is, as I say, technically medieval in its nature. Well, these are the issues being posed by the crisis. Who controls the system? Is there another way? Traditional reform, allowing the ownership and control of wealth and corporate power, traditionally, and attempting through reform and regulation to hedge it in, that's what's failing. And as that fails, we're being forced to ask new questions about what is really the design. If you don't like capitalism, if you don't like traditional socialism, what do you want? And then how do you get there? I think those are the questions we're being posed. And as I say, the place to think about it and to get a handle on it is those civil rights workers in the 1930s and 40s. To say that you could change the system in the South in the 1930s and the 40s was to say, I am willing to be hung from a tree, and many were, but also to say that it was possible over time, with patience and thought and commitment, over time, steadily, to lay the basis of a transformation. We shall overcome. So I'm not a utopian optimist. I'm a realist, and I think that there is a finite chance that an evolutionary process in this country, as in many others, as in the Arab Spring, as in the beginning points of all that, has that option available. And I'm very cautious in saying that. I think it's a finite and realistic option. Whatever we do in that direction is positive, no matter what. But a transformative vision is also a possibility that people have not allowed themselves to think about it And it's time we ourselves began to say, that's what's on the table, and we need to we need to step up to that possibility and think about it and begin to commit in that direction rather than to hold back and say, well, nothing can be done. That's not the way, that's not the lesson of history in times of difficulty and pain. The lesson historically is that sometimes, often, if people stand back and make the commitment, new possibilities occur. And certainly, if new possibilities are not attempted, nothing will occur. But what is exciting is when people just begin to get a sense of the power that a movement gives it. You see it in the Tea Party. They reinforce each other. You see it in our side on the Madison and Wisconsin fights. The reconstruction of that excitement and that level of commitment and that energy and that consciousness, that's what's at stake. The question is, can we harness it to a vision of how to restructure the system rather than to empower another failing minor reform movement? That's what's at stake. And as I say, it is maybe the most important period of American history, maybe bar none, because we're talking about really systemic change, not just political change and economic change.